Welcome to 20 Minute Tabletop, a weekly podcast about board, card and miniatures games. It's a solo cast today from me, Kev. I'm going to be taking you through a history of interactive fiction. Now, when I say interactive fiction, you may just think of the Gamebooks of Choose Your Own Adventure, Fighting Fantasy, and more recently, The Darkness of Arkham, the Arkham Horror Gamebook. But actually, this mechanic pops up in all kinds of games, from Gloomhaven to more esoteric games like Hildegard from the Spire's End series. So join me on this podcast and we're going to have a look at some of the history and notable titles in this absolutely fascinating genre. So I would be amazed if the listeners of this podcast haven't at some point had contact with an interactive fiction title of some description. Now, for me, it was the Fighting Fantasy books. I'm a child of the 80s and kind of came into kind of the independent reading late 80s, early 90s in school. And that was where I discovered these kind of tales of fantasy. Do you choose the left corridor or the right corridor? Are you going to pick up the treasure chest or attack the goblin? And to be able to do that in the school environment was just like playtime for me. I absolutely loved it. I actually got told off for bringing dice in, so I came up with the ingenious idea, even if I do say so, of making marks on my Staedtler yellow and black school issue pencil. And I don't know if this is a worldwide phenomenon, but certainly in the UK, all the kids have got these HB pencils, yellow and black, and they've got 6 sides. So if you make a mark, a dot, with another pencil or a drawing pin, then you've got a dice. So I used to use this homemade dice. What a rebel I was. To play Fighting Fantasy. It does paint a picture of what a geek I was from a very early age. But that was my first contact. But I was shocked to learn that this genre not only has infiltrated the modern day board games and things like Gloomhaven, which we'll talk about later in the podcast, but it goes a long way back, all the way to 1930. I thought this was a purely 80s D&D revival type phenomenon, but no, there is more to it. So before I get deeper into the different types of titles and some of the history of it, it's worth just discussing what this genre is. It's not like the theatre of the mind that you have in Dungeons & Dragons or another RPG, where you have a totally open-ended story system where you can effectively do anything, and you need a games master to be able to provide some kind of law and order to the situation and give you odds and probabilities and progress the story. This is a very much on-rails adventure, where you'll be reading through a passage of text and you'll be presented with a number of options. You choose an option and you take a branch of the story. And this interactive story is effectively like a big logic tree. And there's all kinds of software that you can download to help flesh out your own ones. And they became very popular in the 80s as text adventures, with Infocom being one of the main publishers. And this idea of the 80s style interactive fiction text adventure computer game was actually on Netflix with Black Mirror Bandersnatch, where you use your remote control to choose options, and I think there was 5 different endings and various branches in the storyline. So it's something that has permeated modern culture, all the way from the books to TV shows, computer games, and now board games. But the first example, as far as I can find, is in the 1930s with a book called Consider the Consequences. And Consider the Consequences was published by Doris Webster and Mary Alden Hopkins and presented a series of basically relationship choices. Now, the internet being the internet, someone has recreated this story in kind of an online text adventure style where you choose the different options presented in the book. And there'll be a link in the show notes in the description, but gtheriot.itch.io has basically recreated this. And let's start off with the blurb. Now, I played through one of the stories and I thought, well, it was hilarious. I wrought havoc with this poor guy's life. So I'll read you the blurb of the book so you can get a feel for what it's about. It's obviously in the 1930s style. Life is not a continuous line from the cradle to the grave. Rather, it is many short lines, each ending in a choice and a branching right or left to other choices, like a bunch of seaweed or a genealogical table. No sooner is one problem solved than you face another growing out of the first. You are to decide the course of action of first Helen, then Jed, then Saunders, at each a crisis in their lives. Give your first thought without pausing to ponder. This game may be played as a solitaire, a courting game, or a party stunt. When the players disagree, follow the choice of the majority, but make note of the dissenting opinion so that you can return later and find out what happens to Helen or Jed or Saunders when the other advice is followed. I mean, if you heard that in a shut up and sit down review about a relationship simulator where you can play with people's lives, you'd think it was a brilliant novel concept, especially seeing it's got a solitaire mode. But let's have a look at the different problems people will be facing. So we've got Helen. Should a girl marry against the advice of her parents? Helen Rogers faces this problem. Jed Harringdale was the only son of a widow. If she'd been poor widow, he would have been very different and perhaps a finer character, but he would have been expected to assume responsibility early. But she was so very rich that she took good care of him, perhaps too much care and too long for his best good. Saunders Meep was brought up in a pleasant frame house, painted white, in Franklin, a small New England town. His father, who was the postmaster, had only a small income, but the Mead children never thought of themselves poor because there were always cookies in the pantry. So I played through the story of Jed, looking for basically maximum humour. So Jed is awful, absolutely terrible, and he's absolutely doted on by his mother, and he's afraid to step out from her shadow, but he's also a bit of a player. So Jed, being the player that he is, goes to the fun fair and meets Gwen, and after a night of passion, later Gwen reveals to him that she's carrying his child, and Jed has to decide, should he marry Gwen or should he refuse to marry Gwen? Well, of course, I'm role-playing Jed, being absolutely awful, so naturally he goes with his mother's instinct, no girl is good enough for Jed, and he does not marry. And the story reveals to us that when she went to New York, where the child was later born in a hospital, Gwen's child was immediately adopted by a wealthy couple, Mr. and Mrs. Edward Jormellan. Of course, you've got to remember this is the 1930s, and you couldn't possibly have a single mother raising a child. So, Jed, after having ruined one person's life, he goes to college and he drops out because he just doesn't go to classes. He's very rich. He doesn't need any of that nonsense. But he does, however, meet Carol, who becomes the love of his life. He felt old and mature behind her young innocence, but he realised that a man's life is different from a woman's. So he tells Carol of Gwen and the child, to which Carol replies, I'm glad that you talk so frankly to me. It makes it easy for me to tell something you ought to know. Then, to Jed's horror, she told him with simple directness that she too had known the intimacies of love. It had happened the summer before, in a mad infatuation, under the combined influence of moonlight, roses, and a last cocktail. In agony, Jed gasped, How could you? You have ruined our love. In genuine surprise, Carol replied, But you did the same thing yourself. It's different with a man, protested Jed. Carol indignantly stood up for the single standard. If she forgave him, he should forgive her. The reader should wish Jed to go on with the marriage. Of course not. Jed is going to break up with Carol, and so yet another life ruined, laying in waste behind the juggernaut that is Jed. And Jed carries on in this fashion, laying waste to life after life after life, before he finally comes upon Helen, who he is infatuated with. However, his mother is very distressed. She does not like Helen. And so the final choice, this horrible, horrible story arc, is presented as the reader is to decide that he is to marry Helen or stand by his mother and shun Helen. Well, at this point, I thought I'd give Jed a happy ending, so to speak. And this is some key excerpts from the final glorious paragraph of Jed's story. Jed was 2 hours late to his wedding because his mother was in a state, even while the minister was making Jed and Helen a man and wife. His mother had a stroke, which deprived her the power of speech and motion. The wedding trip was postponed, and basically 6 years later, she died. And Jed took up sketching. He was fairly good at it, went on to become a fairly average painter. And the beautiful ending to the story, the consequence of Jed's disobeying his irrationally jealous mother was that everyone except the mother was moderately happy. What a lovely end to the story. So that is well worth checking out. There's a link in the description. I haven't played through the other two characters, but I can only imagine they are as ridiculous as that. And they say in the blurb of the book that it could be used as a party stunt. I want to go to that party. I can just imagine a sea of faces aghast with horror as someone is ruining Jed and other people's lives. Absolutely ridiculous. So following that, the scene went dead a little bit, perhaps understandably so, after the performance of Jed and his friends. But there really wasn't a lot until 1976, when Edward Packard basically rebirthed the genre and came out with Sugarcane Island. And after the fairly edgy content of 1930s, Consider the Consequences, it went a little bit tamer, because after all, it was a book intended for children, Sugarcane Island. And as the protagonist, you're shipwrecked on a mysterious tropical island, and you must navigate the challenges of survival, explore the island's secrets, and decide how to handle the various dangers and opportunities that arise. The story is filled with branching paths, offering different outcomes based on your choices. And the themes are survival and exploration, and there is no game element as such. In the latter fighting fantasy books we'll come on to, you need dice and all things like that. This is just you choose an option, follow the option in a branching story. But this book is widely considered as the birth of the Choose Your Own Adventure series, which is actually an intellectual property and became massive, particularly in the States, less so in the UK. And he worked together with R.A. Montgomery to create, in 1979, so just 3 years later, The Cave of Time. So there's no complicated game mechanics, and there's a whole series of books, over 180 in the Choose Your Own Adventure series. And the Choose Your Own Adventure CYOA brand was bought by ChooseCo in 2005. They've been releasing books throughout the period. I think the last one was 2022. R.A. Montgomery, one of the original authors, has new books in the series, Zombies, The Return. And there's even a whole series for younger readers. So if you've got kids 5 to 8, then the Dragonlark books have got simpler plots and vocabulary, and they feature your very own robot and Dragon Day. So plenty of options, still a thriving brand, but I think aficionados within the interactive fiction world, and you can imagine it's the internet, there's forums about it. It's always been considered kind of the poorer cousin of the fighting fantasy world. Developed in 1982 by the founders of Games Workshop, no less, Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone. And this is what I remember, the line art, the slightly hammy writing, the RPG light where you actually had an inventory and all kinds of interesting gameplay in The Warlock of Firetop Mountain. That was the first release, and that I have a vivid memory of reading through that at school with my makeshift Staedtler pencil D6. Now, The Warlock of Firetop Mountain was the first, and it's definitely not considered one of the best fighting fantasy books, perhaps for nostalgia value. Now, I don't remember a lot of them. I read so many as a youngster, but apparently look on a few forums. Dead of Night, Legend of the Shadow Warriors, Moonrunner are all good titles and worth checking out. But the basic vibe with the fighting fantasy is that you would have a character sheet, and you'd have attributes such as stamina and skill and luck, and you would use your D6, real or makeshift, to engage in various checks throughout the game. So you'd also have an inventory. You'd be adventuring through the world. You may find a key. Write that in your inventory. Later on, you present with a choice. If you have the key, go to page 35. If you don't, go to page 34. And you'll be able to use your stamina and luck in a really simple kind of combat system. I think you would basically roll 2d6. You would add either your attack strength or you'd modify it with your luck. And if it was less than the enemy's attack score, you'd lose 2 stamina. And if you beat the enemy, then they would lose 2 stamina. So nothing that's going to set the world on fire. And actually, there's been a new book in the Arkham horror series, The Darkness Over Arkham, that we're going to come back to towards the end of this podcast, which uses more of a modern day RPG type mechanic where you're managing resources and clues and dooms and all the thing that us Arkham Horror the Living card game fans love. And I've been playing through that book as well, and it's fantastic. But for sure, the fighting fantasy is what ignited my love of this genre and also allowed me to see its influence right through to modern day times. The artwork was fantastic. It was the real 80s Games Workshop style ink work, really cool. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of the kind of passages that you might come across in the book. You open the door into a narrow passage and follow it northwards. Some meters up the passageway, it turns east and then turns to the north. However, at the second bend, there is a small alcove in the rock. It seems a convenient hiding place, and a large rock forms a comfortable seat. You may stop here and eat provisions if you wish. When you have rested, continue northwards. go to page 253, and you go through making choices. The guard is tossing his hand two small white objects. Will you sit down as he tells you? Leave the room and return to the junction, or draw your sword and rush forwards? And you'll be flicking back and forth, and obviously these lend themselves quite well to a digital format, and I remember them from primary school on the BBC Micro, giving you an idea of how old I am, of typing in, go east, take the ladder, open the mailbox. And it was a whole world of joy, and it has echoes to this present day. But we will come back to Arkham Horror, the darkness over Arkham, at the end of this. But to break away from traditional game books, interactive fiction, branching storylines, whatever you want to call it, this mechanic has found its way into lots of tabletop games, notably Gloomhaven, Legacy of Dragonholt, and of course my favourite game, Arkham Horror, the living card game. All of these have aspects of branching narratives where the choices you make throughout the game influence the path of your story arc and how the game plays out later on down the line. Now, lots of people have talked about those, so I want to shine a spotlight on Greg Favreau's pair of games that are a little bit less well known. That is Spire's End and its follow-up, Hildegard. But his first game was Spire's End, and it is some of the most striking game art that I have ever seen. It's all inked. It's black, white, and red. So those three colours form out all of the art in the game. So it's visually extremely striking. And I'm going to read you the first card, because what it is a deck of cards. Now in Spire's End, there's a few dice and tokens and things. It all fits in like a big tarot card box kind of size. And the story is this. The ground shook, and something unimaginable drilled its way out of the earth. It tore through the town with ungodly force. The streets ripped through the fumes, and the townsfolk fell into a deep, unnatural sleep. The strong, the frail, and the innocent all disappeared under the red eclipse. The spire stood there in silence. At its base, a door was left ajar. And that is the first card. What an introduction and hook that is to the game. And essentially in the game, you'll choose one of a few different heroes, and you will adventure into the Spire, trying to work out what on earth has happened to your town. This enormous tower has appeared out of nowhere. And it's solitaire. You play out the cards one at a time, and it's very choose your own adventure. But it's pretty gory too. It's definitely not one to play with children, but it's a game that I really enjoyed. I played it through a couple of times. Interestingly, I don't actually have the urge to play it again, but that also plays into the conversation Tom and I had the other week, is you've paid your money, you've had your experience. It was good. It was a memorable time, and I really enjoyed Spire's End. But I've got to say, I enjoyed the follow-up to Spire's End a lot more, and that is Hildegard, which is way lighter. The colour palette, again, instead of being black, white, and red, it's autumnal colours. So you've got oranges and yellows and reds. It's absolutely beautiful. You play as Hildegard, who's kind of a plucky protagonist. She's one of the characters from the first game, and she has a little slingshot, and she goes about attacking her enemies with the slingshot, and it's a lot more whimsical and light-hearted than Spire's End. In the first opening scenario, you're given a package, and you don't know who this package is for or where it's to go, but you're given some directions and you set off on your merry way. And what is genius about this game is there's no rule book. Really, I mean, there's a couple of pages, but there doesn't need to be, because everything is explained in the deck of cards. You open the first card, it tells you what to do. You get to make a simple choice from a couple of cards, and you're playing through. There's very, very light. I think it's got a rating of about 1.7 complexity on Board Game Geek. And that is not a criticism, because I love a complex game, but I love the simplicity of this. It allows you to experience the story with much more enjoyment of gameplay than the fighting fantasy books, which are just roll 2d6, add a number, oh, unlucky. In this, there's real meaty choices, because the main mechanic of the game is around what are known as slingshot dice. And it's a number of dice, I think 5 or 6 orange dice off the top of my head. And you're trying to make targets, as in the target you might hit with a slingshot. And the 6 sides of the dice show different components that could make up that target. There may be a dot, and there may be a circle. Those can be combined to make a target. There may be the left-hand bracket, right-hand bracket. Those combine to make a circle. Combine it together with another dot. you've got the target shape. So as you progress through the story, you'll either have to hit things with your slingshot, or you maybe even have to fight enemies in what's known as a face-off. It's a really lightweight experience that allows you to experience the story, but still have some fun gameplay, and that is something that I heartily recommend. I think that is the next evolution of fighting fantasy books. But he only sells through his own website, so you won't find it on Zatu or Amazon. So fair play to Greg for that. But Favreau.com, I urge you to check it out. It is beautiful and well worth an investigation. So with that little detour into the world of board games, let's come back to where it all started with the Gamebooks, and one in my favourite universe, the Arkham horror universe. Now, they recently released a gamebook called The Darkness Over Arkham. You can play as 3 well-known characters, Agnes Baker, Nathaniel Cho, or Rex Murphy, and you're investigating more eldritch goings-on in the town of Arkham. But like Fighting Fantasy, they've evolved the RPG light a little bit more. You're tracking stamina, clues, health, doom, all the stuff that you do in the card game, but you don't quite know how you're going to do it. Yes, you're going to be rolling dice to try and beat skill checks. I guess that's a little bit like interacting with a chaos bag, but I'll give you an example of an outcome. I won't spoil the story, but one of the outcomes of a story element is take 1 health, -1 health and +2 doom, then turn to 140. You may spend 1 clue or 1 resource to reduce the doom penalty by 1, or spend 2 clues and 2 resources to avoid adding any doom at all. So throughout the game, you're managing your inventory, you're picking up items, which is pretty novel, and you're using them, if you've got this diary, then go to this page. If you don't, then, take the skill check. It's really clever. It's the next evolution. And I played this on the Kindle, which is not a usual sentence, played it on the Kindle. But it's quite good because it saves all the back and forth, flicking back and forth. You just click the hyperlink in the Kindle and it takes you to that page. So that's well worth checking out, and nicely brings us back to where we started with the interactive gamebook fiction, although perhaps at its most developed point in this stage. So thank you very much for listening. I'm sure there's loads of titles that you love that I've missed out, particularly board games that I've missed. So let us know on our Discord. There's a link in the show notes. You can chat to me and Tom and our growing community of tabletop enthusiasts. So again, thank you for listening. If you like the podcast, then please leave us a 5-star review. That really helps us. And if you want to give us some more support, we do have a Patreon. And if you join that, then you'll get some full flat wargaming scenery that's perfect for RPGs, D&D, Age of Sigmar, you name it. If it's got miniatures, that scenery will be good for you. So check that out. But more importantly, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.